The comic book movie, we all know it, some of us love them, some of us don't, but undeniably has a really long history within Hollywood. This video will be a review on the newest Superman movie, which is ushering in a new era of DC films, ostensibly a new era of comic book movies, and thus I think it's important to at least acknowledge the root, acknowledge the comic book movie origin. When I say comic book movies now, immediately the thought goes to, for most people, the MCU. But obviously, the comic book movie did not start with the MCU. Ironically enough, there is a valid argument that Superman in 1978 is the blueprint or the grandfather of the modern-day superhero film. However, the Marvel Cinematic Universe did have a profound effect on not only how audiences engage with superhero films, but how filmmakers approach them. And in 2013, Warner Brothers would respond to the MCU mania with their own version of an extended universe in the DCEU. Coincidentally, the movie they chose to usher in that universe was Man of Steel, and what would follow then is about 10 years of very interesting decisions, a few ups and a lot of downs. And to be fair, there was a promise that the hierarchy would change.
The hierarchy of power in the DC universe is about to change.
However, I don't think it was in the way Dwayne Johnson intended it to be. Because in 2022, James Gunn and Peter Safran would be appointed head of DC Studios as co-CEOs and take over the future of all DC films, which leads us to this exact moment. Superman, anticipated by many, dreaded by some, specifically the hardcore fans of Zack Snyder, aka the Snyder Cult. A deep dive on that fandom will be needed one day. But the question I want to ask and then answer in this video is, does this Superman set the DCU off in the right direction? Are they starting off on the right foot? We'll answer that at the end of the video. This video review will be spoiler-free for the first couple of minutes, some higher-level thoughts and reactions, and then halfway through, we'll get into some more specific details about scenes and decisions. But of course, as always, I will sound off the spoiler siren when that happens. Let's begin with the story and the script. This is an interesting aspect because this movie is not an origin story. A big risk when doing a reboot, especially a reboot of a character as iconic as Superman. Instead, the movie chooses to throw us into Superman's life, his personal, professional, and romantic life. Superman has been known to the world for about 3 years. Lois knows his identity. He's loved by many, despised by some. The choice of foregoing an origin story and throwing us into the chaos of this world is a choice I think I ultimately love. However, with that being said, I don't really blame people who are saying they're having a harder time finding a connection to these characters because the movie doesn't spend any real time establishing the characters and or their relationships. However, I do find that despite not getting the foundation of these relationships, I feel a sense of connection to the characters, and the emotions feel earned largely because of the performances. And if the story has one major issue, it's not because we're just thrown into the chaos of the world, it's because there's too much going on. It's an overstuffed, overwhelmed movie. Characters, subplots, themes, there's a lot going on, and we'll explore more of this specifically on the spoiler side of the video. As I alluded to earlier, I find every performance in this movie near perfect. It is an extremely well cast. Cast, by the way, casted is not a word. Technically, it is a word, but that is used for fishing, which we're not fishing right now, so we're using the word cast. Anyways, it's extremely well cast, immaculate. Let's go through them rapid fire. David Corenswet as Superman. Brilliant. He brings such an effortless sense of hope and kindness to the character. It reminded me a lot of Christopher Reeve's iteration of Superman through his mannerisms and his delivery of certain lines. He's the awkward Boy Scout who is hopelessly in love, but will do anything to ensure that people and living beings are safe. It's very different from Cavill's more cold and stoic approach, which has its moments, but I think I prefer this approach a lot more. Rachel Brosnahan is maybe my favorite Lois Lane ever. Smart, confident. Her character prioritizes journalism almost over anything, which leads into some really fascinating conversations of journalism and ethics. Nicholas Hoult could be my favorite character in the movie. I'm a huge fan of villains who are straight up haters, and Nicholas Hoult is fully committed to the hater bit. But also, when people are describing the tone of this movie as being more in line with a comic book, I think a lot of that is rooted in his performance, which is a bit silly and a bit over the top, but I think really works for this movie. And everyone else is very good. Nathan Fillion as Guy Gardner, very funny. Isabella Merced as Hawk Girl, maybe not enough of her, but some very fun moments. Crypto the dog, scene stealer, and a very good boy. Let's get that dog a solo movie ASAP. Metamorpho, not in the movie a ton. Hard to get a read on that one, but I liked what I saw. The Daily Planet crew, they're fun, they're quippy, would like to see more of them. The only person who deserves more than a one-line reaction is Eddie Gathegi's Mr. Terrific, who will end up being, and deservedly so, a fan favorite for many. Has arguably the coolest action scene in the movie, but you can maybe see where I'm going with this. With all of these characters, it's frustrating to get a character this interesting or this cool and have them share the spotlight with 10 other people. There will be some inevitable cannibalization, stories, characters, arcs that cannot flourish, cannot develop, because what's the magic phrase of the episode? There's too much going on. And I'll never understand how this continues to be a huge problem for superhero films, especially when we witness the MCU have this specific issue for the last 5 or 6 years. Because when you look at a movie like Spider-Man 1 and Spider-Man 2 specifically, those two movies where they have a dedicated one villain. Notice how I didn't say Spider-Man 3, a movie that I like, but considerably not as good as the first two, and you can point to the movie's overabundance of characters. I digress. It's just interesting to see that this is a continuous problem for so many superhero films on both sides of the aisle, Marvel and DC. And not to press on this issue further, but my theory is that it's a studio response to the audience demand for more. But that might be a different video for a different day. Other spoiler-free thoughts. This movie is a James Gunn movie. Wasn't sure if you were aware of that. It's directed and written by James Gunn. So what does that mean? It means tonally, it's a bit all over the place. And this is something that's always existed within the James Gunn filmography, but feels more polished in movies like Guardians of the Galaxy, and in Superman feels a lot more jarring. There are scenes in this movie that are very dark, specifically one scene with Lex, but the weight of the conflict and what is unfolding is never really felt because so many of those serious moments are undercut by gags and jokes. And the humor, by the way, super subjective. I find it pointless for any critic or commentator to ever say the humor is bad or the jokes are bad, because what I find funny, you may not find funny, and vice versa. The jokes in this movie, 70% of them worked on me, but they may not work on you. Who knows? Does the movie look good? That'll be a very popular talking point for a lot of people. And maybe people don't want to hear this, but there are times where it feels like the movie looks similar to The Flash. It doesn't stoop to those abysmal levels of visual and CGI effects, but the last climactic CGI fight looks a bit rough around the edges. Nothing that completely took me out of the movie, but I could see it being another hang-up for some people. But these are just some high-level thoughts and my immediate reactions to the movie. To fully understand why the movie works or what prevents it from fully flourishing, let's talk specific details. I love Superman and Lois's relationship. Corrin Sweat and Brosnahan's chemistry is off the charts, and I think it's the most evident towards the beginning of the film in the scene where Lois interviews Superman in her apartment for the very first time. Arguably the best scene in the movie. It's smart, it's thought-provoking, it's really well written, but why it really works is that in Lois's challenging and interrogation of Superman's ethics, it is also challenging the audience's own expectation and assumptions. There are consequences to what Superman does or does not do, who he decides to protect and save. These are things that don't often get brought up in these movies, or at least not in this more confrontational manner. The political and social ramifications of being Superman. It's a scene that beautifully illustrates Lois as a character and further highlights the movie's central thematic obstacle for Superman. The problem with the scene? It's the only one of its kind in the movie. There isn't enough Lois and Clark, Lois and Superman moments in the movie that would really justify their unwavering love for each other. This is the major pitfall of not being an origin story, that if you want an audience to believe your characters are in love, there needs to be more. They need to earn it. And this is just one of the byproducts of the movie being really overwhelmed with ideas. As funny as the Justice Gang is, and trust me, they're a hoot and a half, but every time we cut to them, the momentum of the story is being stifled and cut in half. There's an entire sequence in this movie in like a pocket universe where we meet Metamorpho. This feels like the movie's lowest point, both narratively and visually. And as much as I love Lex, the final confrontation between Lex and Superman can be a bit on the nose the way it's written. But I've chosen to look at this exchange as a moment ripped directly from a comic book, so I don't mind it. What I do mind and I don't really like is when Krypto interrupts the exchange to thrash Lex around, very similar to what Hulk does to Loki in the Avengers. But the movie is riddled with a lot of these more on-the-nose moments that are trying to clearly illustrate Superman's moral compass, and I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing. There's a scene dedicated to Superman saving a squirrel, there's a scene dedicated to Superman admonishing the Justice Gang for killing a kaiju rather than rescuing it or preserving its life. I've come to appreciate this movie's very intentional decisions to illustrate Superman as somebody who values all living things. And it's small moments like this and these small exchanges between characters that I find mirror the traditional comic book the most. Like when you would turn the page of a comic book and see a panel and the hero is saving a dog, or the hero is explaining to citizens why it's wrong to be violent or to kill. I appreciate moments like this in the movie. I find it refreshing. The climax I mostly like. My hesitance stems from the big reveal that Ultraman is a clone of Superman. I don't know if I've said this in the video already, but I'm not a Superman comic book reader, so whether or not this is canonical does not matter to me. The reveal itself I found predictable and weightless. Was I supposed to feel something in that moment? I think that was the intention, but I did not. And again, that's just because there's no screen time allotment for Ultraman. I don't know who that guy is. I don't know his motivations, or I don't know anything about him, which is brushing against what I think the movie's biggest negative is, and that's just the lack of world building in general. However, on the same side of that world building coin, I have a lot of appreciation for how contained the movie is. I like that it's not setting up, at least not directly, a new film, a new villain, a new story. If the DCU were to end tomorrow, this is a movie that could stand on its own. That feels extremely rare. It's something the MCU has been terrible at doing over the last 5 to 6 years, creating stories that could just stand on its own. There's a fun reveal at the end that I think a lot of studios should learn from. Supergirl shows up for like maybe 30 seconds of screen time, but it's enough time to establish a rapport and give us insight of what we can expect from the future without sacrificing the narrative of the movie. Thematically, I really appreciate this movie's taking a more overt approach. Superman has been and always will be an immigrant story. Lois battling the ethics of journalism, Lex understanding the power of media, but more specifically, wielding and manipulating the power of social media. Lex, and as an extension to Lex, America as the contributor, but also as like the puppeteer to overseas conflict and bloodshed. Like its characters, there are probably one to too many themes here to unpack. However, I admire its ambition. So to go back to the opening question, does this movie, does Superman 2025 start the DCU in the right direction? For me, it's an unequivocal yes. It's an exciting refresh for this character and this universe. It's a flawed movie. It's overly ambitious, but it exudes so much personality and so much heart. It unapologetically embraces its comic book roots and comic book tone and still lays the foundation for an inspiring and exciting DCU future. Let me know what you think of the movie. Of course, be kind in the comments. People can be very passionate, and I respect that, but we can still have civilized conversations. I'm not even normally a big comic book person, but I always find big blockbusters like this interesting to talk about. What to expect from the channel? Of course, a video on Fantastic Four, which comes out in a couple weeks. Before that, I'm going to do my best to work on a video on the top 10 movies of 2024. 2024? Whoa, what year am I in?
What year is it?
2025. I've seen over 100 of this year's new movies, so it should be an interesting list, I hope. But that's it. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, do all the YouTube things, and have a wonderful day, night, weekend, and I'll see you guys next time.